The blade fell upon a queen, and silence spread over Paris, heavier than the autumn air. The roar that followed was not only of triumph, but of disbelief, for the daughter of emperors, the Queen of France, had bowed her head to the guillotine. In that single instant, centuries of ritual and power seemed to shatter, and the echo of her final breath has never wholly vanished from the memory of Europe. Wherever you are listening, whether in a quiet room or under distant skies, share in the comments when and where you listen as we weave a circle of memory together. And do not forget to subscribe. Marie Antoinette, her name still lingers like a perfume long after the bottle has been broken. To some, she was a martyr. To others, a frivolous shadow, careless of hunger while she arranged flowers and played shepherdess in silken gowns. Her story belongs to that fragile space where fact and rumor dissolve into one another. She was born in the music-filled halls of Vienna, married into the dazzling world of Versailles, and perished on the scaffold, leaving behind whispers, questions, and symbols that no historian has fully untangled. It is her life we now journey through, not as scholars dissecting, but as listeners gathered around an ancient fire, where the flames reveal faces and shadows, and the storyteller allows silence to do as much as words. In the year 1755, amid the courtly brilliance of Vienna, a child was born who would one day be known as the most tragic of queens. Archduchess Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa, opened her eyes to a world filled with light, reflected on polished marble, with music that wove through the corridors of the Habsburg palace like a gentle, unending stream. She was not the firstborn, nor destined for the throne of her homeland. Her life, from its earliest breath, was already a matter of alliance, of treaties, of the endless chessboard upon which Europe moved its pawns and queens. Vienna in those days was a city of both grandeur and intimacy. Its gardens stretched wide, filled with trimmed hedges and sculpted fountains, while the air often carried the faint sweetness of lilacs in spring and the mellow smoke of winter fires. Within the palace, candlelight flickered over walls painted with allegories of triumph, ceilings where gods and goddesses floated in clouds of color. One can imagine the child Antonia running across vast polished floors, her laughter mingling with the measured notes of harpsichords played by older siblings. She was said to have a carefree spirit, light-hearted with bright eyes and a smile that softened even the strict gazes of tutors. Yet her education was not rigorous, not as finely sharpened as some of her sisters. Some would later blame her seeming frivolity upon these early indulgences, though who can say what paths are truly shaped by the books left unread? Her mother, the Empress, was formidable, commanding armies and negotiating treaties, while also tending, in her fashion, to her large brood. Maria Theresa was a woman who combined piety with practicality, who saw her children less as independent souls and more as emissaries of dynasty. To her, Antonia was a piece upon the board, destined not for Vienna, but for a throne elsewhere. Did the young girl know this, as she played in the gardens, as she listened to masses sung beneath gilded domes? Perhaps she sensed only that she belonged to a world larger than herself, where choices were already whispered over her head. Music was the heartbeat of her childhood. Vienna was the city of Haydn and Mozart, of courtly balls where minuets traced circles into the night. Antonia herself learned to play the harp, to sing, to dance, to move gracefully through the spaces where appearances were as crucial as substance. Imagine the little archduchess, fingers brushing strings, her voice carrying softly into twilight rooms where chandeliers shed trembling light. Such images cling because they remind us that even figures later made into symbols were once children, innocent of what history would carve into their names. Yet even in childhood, shadows touched her life. The 18th century was not gentle with infants and children. Disease moved silently through palaces as easily as through villages. Several of her siblings died young, and death became a familiar presence, though softened by ritual and faith. For Antonia, survival itself was a privilege, and in surviving, she carried the weight of expectation. She would never rule Austria, but she would embody Austria abroad. The years of her youth unfolded like chapters in a book whose ending had already been penned by others. At 14, she was betrothed to the Dauphin of France, grandson of Louis XIII. The union was meant to seal peace between two long rival houses, Habsburg and Bourbon, enemies in wars that had drained Europe of blood and treasure. The young girl was told her destiny, and there was no question of refusal. How could a child raised in the gilded heart of empire imagine denying her mother, her emperor, her lineage? She prepared to leave Vienna, to abandon her language, her familiar streets, her music, even her name. For in France she would no longer be Antonia, but Antoinette, reshaped for a foreign court. One might pause here and ask, what thoughts pass through the mind of a 14-year-old as she faces such exile? Did she fear? Did she dream? Did she trust? Accounts speak of her natural charm, her laughter, her ease of movement, qualities that promised to delight the court of Versailles. Yet beneath the smile, perhaps a tremor stirred, the knowledge that childhood was already ended. Her sisters had married into distant courts, and she had seen their departures, the tears at farewells, the long journeys into unfamiliar lands. Now it was her turn, and no soft word could alter the fact. On the eve of her departure, Vienna might have seemed more luminous than ever. The spires of the city gleamed, the bells of St. Stephen's rang with solemn weight, the gardens stretched in ordered beauty, and the palace stood as a fortress of memory. But the child who had wandered its halls was now a bride chosen for politics, and in her heart the mingling of pride and fear must have burned quietly. The farewell was not only to her family, but to the self she had known. When the carriage wheels began to roll, when the streets of Vienna blurred behind her, the girl who had laughed in music-filled rooms entered the long road toward her fate. Behind her lay the gentle cadence of Austrian voices, the lilacs, the fountains, the familiar prayers. Before her lay France, with its relentless etiquette, its vast court, its people restless beneath the weight of hunger. She could not know that the path she now rode would lead to the blade and to history's harsh judgment. All she knew was that she was leaving home. The air that day was cool, perhaps carrying the faintest scent of rain. The sound of horses' hooves beat steadily against the earth, each strike echoing the rhythm of a destiny already moving forward. And as the carriages disappeared into the distance, Vienna's palace stood still, watching another daughter vanish into the fog of history, never to return. The carriages rolled on, their wheels grinding against the long roads that stretched from Austria into France. And with every passing mile, the young archduchess shed a layer of her former self. The journey was not merely a passage of distance, but of identity, for at the border awaited a ritual unlike any other, one both cruel in its symbolism and delicate in its staging. It was here that the child of Vienna, Maria Antonia, was to become Marie Antoinette, the Dauphine of France. The border between empires was marked not only by rivers and forest, but by ceremony. A pavilion was constructed, half Austrian, half French, its design bearing the weight of politics. Within this carefully crafted space, the bride was to be stripped of every possession, every garment, every token of her homeland, and reclothed as a daughter of France. Such was the custom, a theatrical gesture that declared she now belonged wholly to the soil she was entering. One can imagine the moment, the silence broken only by rustling fabrics, the eyes of attendants fixed on the young girl as they removed her Austrian attire, as each ribbon and jewel was taken away. What must she have felt as her familiar clothing was lifted from her body, as though she herself were being erased and rewritten? The pavilion, cool with the draught of spring, echoed faintly with voices speaking both German and French, the clash of tongues underscoring the gravity of what was happening. She stood shivering not only from the air, but from the enormity of the transformation. When the new garments of French silk were placed upon her, they did not simply cover her. They enclosed her in a destiny that no child could fully comprehend. The ceremony was both intimate and public, a shedding of skin before witnesses, a metaphor made flesh. To her attendants, it was ritual. To the young girl herself, perhaps it felt like an ending. No keepsake from her past was allowed to cross with her. Even letters, even small tokens of affection, were forbidden. She was emptied of her Austrian self, as though she must be reborn in that instant into a creature entirely French. And yet, could silk and ceremony truly alter the heart that still beat in her chest? Could a ritual erase the rhythms of her childhood, the music of Vienna that lingered in her memory? The pavilion doors opened, and the girl now called Marie Antoinette stepped into French territory. The first breath she drew as Dauphine carried with it the scent of foreign soil, damp with the greenness of early spring. Touched by the faint perfume of blossoms along the roadside, her entourage swelled around her, courtiers, attendants, guards, each reminding her that from this moment onward, her every step was watched, her every gesture weighed. The border lay behind her, but its meaning would forever remain. She had crossed from one life into another. The journey onward to Versailles was not swift. Roads in that time were uneven, sometimes swallowed by mud, sometimes traced by dust. Villages appeared along the way, their thatched roofs clustered together, their people lining the roads to glimpse the young bride destined for their future king. Faces weathered by hunger and labor peered at the carriages, some with curiosity, others with muted discontent. For them, she was a vision in silks, a promise of alliance, but also an emblem of a world so far removed from their own daily struggle. Did she see them clearly through the window, or did the distance between silk and soil blur their reality into a mere backdrop for her passage? The French courtiers who traveled with her observed her closely, their eyes searching for flaws, for signs of inadequacy, for anything that might become fodder for gossip at Versailles. They noted her youth, her gaiety, her lack of polish in certain refinements. They whispered already of whether she would charm or disappoint the king's court, a place where a misplaced glance could stir whispers louder than the tolling of bells. The girl herself, though outwardly cheerful, must have felt the weight of those glances. Each smile, each word in halting French was measured, remembered, stored away. In the silence of her carriage at night, did she lie awake wondering what awaited her at Versailles, that palace spoken of as a world unto itself, dazzling yet suffocating in its order. When at last the spires and golden gates of Versailles came into view, it was like a mirage rising from the flatlands. The palace shimmered with its endless windows, reflecting the sky, its gardens stretching with geometric perfection, every tree trimmed, every fountain designed to please the eye. It was no mere residence but a symbol of monarchy itself, the embodiment of a system in which the king was not only ruler, but spectacle. For a 15-year-old girl raised in Vienna's gentler grandeur, this was an overwhelming vision. Versailles was not welcoming, it was consuming. To enter it was to surrender privacy forever. She stepped through its gates, and the eyes of courtiers followed her, eyes trained to read every movement. The sound of her shoes against marble floors echoed faintly, accompanied by the rustling of gowns, the scent of powder and perfume that hung perpetually in the air. Introductions were made. bows performed, each gesture rehearsed and repeated until they became almost mechanical. In those first days, she must have felt as though she were a figure placed upon a stage, her role written, her lines whispered to her by others. Yet beneath the stiffness, a trace of youthful wonder lingered. The vast mirrored halls reflected her image endlessly, as though multiplying her into countless selves. Which one would history remember? And then came the first meetings with the Dauphin, the young Louis, awkward and reserved, already carrying the shadow of his grandfather's court. He was but a boy himself, quiet, uncertain, his interests more attuned to locks, hunting, and solitude than to the games of seduction expected at Versailles. Their marriage, celebrated with pomp, was whispered about almost immediately, for the union, though official, seemed strangely incomplete. The laughter that had once come so easily to Antoinette now mixed with uncertainty, for her new husband's silence created a gulf no ritual could bridge. The crossing of borders, then, was not simply a passage of geography. It was a step into an entirely different rhythm of life, where every moment was performed beneath the gaze of others, where private emotions became public property, where silence could breed suspicion and a smile could incite envy. At the pavilion, she had been stripped of her Austrian garments, but in truth, she was stripped of far more, of innocence, of belonging, of the comfort of being unseen. She had become Marie Antoinette. Yet the echo of Antonia still lingered within her, faint as the memory of a melody once played in a Viennese chamber, now carried like a ghost into the glittering, perilous halls of Versailles. As night fell over the palace, the young Dauphine lay in chambers vast and unfamiliar, where candle flames flickered high above and shadows stretched long upon embroidered curtains. Outside, fountains murmured through the gardens, their ordered streams seeming almost eternal. Yet within her, perhaps there was a silence more profound than the murmur of water, a silence that asked a question she could not yet answer. Who am I, now that I have crossed the border and entered this endless theater of kings? The corridors of Versailles held whispers like shadows, soft and yet impossible to silence, and it was in these murmurs that the fate of the young Dauphine began to take shape. She had crossed the border with silks newly draped upon her. She had walked beneath the gilded ceilings, and she had been presented as the bride of France's heir. Yet the marriage that had been sealed with music and applause soon became the subject of quiet mockery. For behind closed doors, it seemed that the union of Antoinette and Louis remained untouched, a bond unconsummated, a promise unfulfilled. The courtiers, with their insatiable appetite for scandal, wasted no time in twisting silence into story, and each night that passed without heir or evidence became fuel for the murmured gossip that crept through the palace walls. Antoinette was but 15, her husband 16, both scarcely more than children themselves, and yet the weight of an entire kingdom pressed upon their bedchamber. Louis, shy and awkward, sought refuge in hunting, in the study of locks and keys, in pursuits that required no conversation, no intimacy, no confrontation with the expectations that trembled in the air between them. Antoinette, lively and sociable, accustomed to laughter and ease, found herself bewildered by his hesitations, uncertain of how to bridge the distance. The palace, however, offered no mercy to youthful confusion. Each glance of a servant, each raised eyebrow of a courtier, carried a meaning, and soon their marriage was no longer theirs, but a spectacle for the court. Imagine the evenings. The immense chamber heavy with velvet draperies, the flicker of candlelight across golden ornaments, the silence thick between two adolescents thrust into roles they scarcely understood. Outside, beyond the heavy doors, courtiers speculated, papers scribbled notes, letters flew across Europe. Maria Theresa in Vienna grew anxious, sending admonitions to her daughter, urging her to fulfill her duty, to win her husband's affection, to produce heirs for France. The Dauphine herself, though outwardly cheerful, must have felt the sting of inadequacy, the slow erosion of confidence that comes when every fault is magnified by 1,000 eyes. How fragile a girl must feel, lying in a bed where silence grows louder than any voice, where duty and desire fail to meet. In the gardens of Versailles she sought distraction, walking beneath trimmed hedges, inhaling the sweet, heavy scent of orange blossoms that filled the air. She played cards, she danced, she laughed with companions, her youthful energy spilling out into the rigid formality of court life. Yet even her laughter was interpreted with suspicion. Was it frivolity? Was it carelessness? To those who envied her youth, her charm, her place, every smile became a target, every gesture a symbol of her supposed vanity. She could not know then that these whispers, small and cruel, would grow into the monstrous caricatures that later devoured her name. And still the marriage remained incomplete. For 7 long years, the union of Antoinette and Louis was mocked in pamphlets and lampoons, her name entwined with cruel inventions, his with ridicule for weakness. Foreign ambassadors reported gleefully on the failure, spreading the tale across courts and capitals. For the people beyond Versailles, hungry and restless, such stories became symbols of a monarchy unable even to secure its most basic duties. Did Antoinette herself sense that each night of silence was not only personal disappointment, but also political failure? Did she lie awake beneath embroidered canopies, her mind restless with questions of inadequacy, with a growing dread that her body was no longer her own, but a battleground upon which nations measured strength and failure? The isolation was profound. Though surrounded by hundreds, she was often alone. Her confidences betrayed, her gestures misunderstood. She wrote letters to her mother, letters filled with obedience, yet beneath the careful words one might sense a trembling girl longing for guidance, for affection, for reassurance that she was not failing utterly in the task thrust upon her. In return came admonitions, stern instructions, reminders that she was not free to live but bound to duty. How heavy those words must have lain upon her, heavier perhaps than the diamonds she wore at court, for jewels can be set aside, but a mother's command cannot. The courtiers delighted in spectacle, and even the most intimate matters of her life became theater. It was said that each morning her rising was attended by a procession, each gesture of her toilette observed, each word weighed. Privacy was a luxury she never knew, and thus her marriage, too, became fodder for public consumption. Whispers carried through gilded halls like faint draughts of air, unceasing, unseen, but always felt. They asked why the Dauphine had not yet quickened with child, why the bed remained cold, whether she herself was to blame. Such suspicions grew not from knowledge but from silence, and silence can be more damning than words. And yet, amid this cruel scrutiny, Antoinette's spirit remained outwardly bright. She danced in masked balls, the sound of violins carrying into the night, candle flames casting soft shadows upon her face. She laughed with companions, the echoes of her voice softening the rigid stone corridors. Perhaps in those moments she forgot the whispers. Perhaps she felt once more the carefree girl of Vienna. But as dawn approached, the laughter faded, and the weight of expectation returned, pressing down as heavily as the golden ceilings above her bed. It is here that we may pause and wonder, what is the measure of duty when bound to a child's heart? Can a girl of 15, 16, 17 be judged for failing to fulfill expectations carved from centuries of ritual and politics? Or is the true cruelty that she was forced to bear such judgment at all? Versailles, with its endless mirrors, reflected not her true self, but the desires, envies, and condemnations of those who gazed upon her. Each reflection was distorted, and in time the distortion grew stronger than the girl herself. The silence of her marriage became the beginning of her legend, a legend not of her making, but of others. And as the whispers deepened, so too did the distance between reality and perception. She was no longer simply Antoinette, a young bride uncertain of her husband's affection. She became a symbol of failure, of frivolity, of foreignness. The corridors of Versailles, with their gilded ceilings and echoing floors, carried the sound of those whispers endlessly, until they seemed to become part of the very air she breathed. And yet within her chamber at night, as the candlelight burned low and shadows stretched long upon the walls, she remained simply a girl, waiting for her husband to turn toward her, waiting for affection, for closeness, for the tender bond that might silence the rumors. She listened, perhaps, to the distant sounds of the fountains outside, their endless murmur a reminder that time flowed on, indifferent to her fear, her hope, her longing. And with each night that passed, the silence grew louder until it filled the palace like an unending echo. Through the endless mirrors and corridors of Versailles, where whispers grew heavier than stone, the young Dauphine walked beneath ceilings painted with gods, who looked down as though they themselves were judges of her fate. The silence of her marriage lingered behind her like a veil, yet the palace demanded of her another role, not merely bride, but spectacle. Versailles was no home, no haven, but a theater of power where every gesture became performance, every glance became symbol, and every silence was filled by rumor. It was here that Antoinette learned what it meant to be watched, not by a handful of eyes, but by a multitude whose gaze never faltered. The palace itself was overwhelming, a city contained within walls of gold and marble. Its gardens stretched outward with impossible symmetry, fountains casting their silver arcs into the air, trimmed hedges whispering of control, of order imposed upon nature itself. Within the chambers, the air was thick with powder and perfume, scents mingling until they became an invisible mask that clung to every garment and curtain. The click of heels against polished floors, the rustle of gowns layered with silk, the low hum of voices echoing through galleries. These were the sounds that filled her days. To walk in such spaces was to be reminded that nothing belonged to oneself. Even the air seemed claimed by the rituals of court. From the moment she rose, the Dauphine was surrounded. Her mornings were a procession, a ballet of attendants who clothed her, offered her ribbons, handed her basins of water in ceremonies that were less about cleanliness than about hierarchy. To reach her, one had to pass through layers of rank, each entitled to a gesture, a moment, a fragment of the ritual. Privacy was stripped from her as thoroughly as her Austrian garments had been at the border, and yet outwardly she smiled, for to frown was to offend, to reveal unease was to invite scorn. The art of Versailles was to disguise discomfort beneath the sheen of grace. Meals, too, were not simply nourishment, but ceremony. The royal table was set as though for a play, where courtiers observed the act of dining as though it were a holy rite. Antoinette learned to eat with 1,000 eyes upon her, to lift her fork with precision, to sip without haste, to maintain the dignity expected of one who would be queen. Did food carry taste in such moments, or did it turn into ash beneath the pressure of performance? The people outside Versailles hungered for bread, yet within these gilded halls, feasts stretched into abundance, dishes so numerous they blurred into excess. And in this contrast between hunger and plenty, between watching eyes and solitary heart, seeds of resentment already stirred in the world beyond the gates. At night, the halls glowed with candlelight, their flames reflected endlessly in gilt and glass. Balls were held where music soared, violins and harpsichords weaving threads of sound into the air until it seemed the walls themselves pulsed with rhythm. As Antoinette, still scarcely more than a child, moved through these nights with grace, her laughter carrying lightly through the perfume-thick air. She danced, she played cards, She sought the company of those who made her feel less alone, less like a prisoner of ritual. In these moments, she escaped the silence of her husband's chamber, the whispers of the courtiers, the weight of expectation. Yet the very brightness of her laughter was noted, repeated, transformed into accusation. Could a dauphine be so merry when her duty lay unfulfilled? Could she indulge in play while the kingdom waited for heirs? Thus the splendor of Versailles was both dazzling and suffocating. Its beauty, its symmetry, its magnificence, these were not comforts but chains, reminding her always that she was not free to falter, not free to retreat, not free even to weep without audience. The palace, in its perfection, demanded perfection from those who lived within it. But perfection is not human, and so every flaw, every hesitation, every misstep became a mark against her. She was not judged as a girl, but as a symbol, and symbols have no permission to err. There were moments, perhaps, when she wandered into the gardens alone, when the sound of fountains drowned the echoes of gossip, when the cool air against her skin reminded her of childhood meadows in Vienna. In those rare moments, she may have closed her eyes and imagined a simpler life, a life without ritual, without endless mirrors, without a court that devoured its own in whispers. But such moments were brief, for attendants followed, and the palace always called her back. The gilded halls were a labyrinth, and there was no true escape. The courtiers, ever hungry for spectacle, tested her with flattery, with demands, with eyes that waited for error. Some admired her youth, her beauty, her charm. Others despised her foreignness, her Austrian birth, her unpolished manners. Every word spoken, every letter sent, every gift received was weighed, dissected, repeated in salons and pamphlets. She became, slowly, less a girl and more a character in the stories of others, her image reshaped not by truth, but by expectation. The splendor of Versailles was a mirror that reflected not who she was, but what others wished to see in her. And so, in the glow of endless candlelight, amid the sound of music that never seemed to rest, the Dauphine walked as though upon a stage where the play never ended. Day by day, she learned to smile when weary, to laugh when uncertain, to hold her head high when whispers grew louder. Yet inside, perhaps, the silence of her marriage, the weight of her duty, and the absence of privacy gnawed at her spirit. Versailles was beautiful, yes, but beauty can wound when it demands the soul as payment. One can picture her, late at night, stepping softly through dim corridors, the scent of extinguished candles still heavy in the air, her gown whispering across marble floors. Alone for a moment, she pauses, her hand brushing against cold stone, her gaze lifting toward the high windows where moonlight seeps in faintly. Beyond those windows lies the world she cannot touch, the villages where people live unseen, the forests where no courtiers linger, the rivers that flow without ceremony. She sighs, and the sound is swallowed by the immensity of the palace. The splendor of Versailles surrounded her, but splendor without freedom is another form of prison. Each day she smiled more brightly, and each night perhaps she wondered more deeply whether she belonged at all in this endless theater of gold and shadow. And the palace, magnificent and merciless, stood silent, watching her as it had watched so many before her, unmoving, unfeeling, eternal. The candlelight flickered softly across embroidered cradles that stood unused in chambers, prepared for heirs who never came. Within the vast palace of Versailles, where splendor glittered from floor to ceiling, there was a silence heavier than the murmurs of gossip or the echo of music. It was the silence of expectation unmet, of absence more piercing than presence. For years, the Dauphine, now queen in all but name, remained without child, and in that absence she became the subject of whispers sharper than blades. In the golden halls, courtiers smiled and bowed, but behind closed doors they questioned. How could it be that a marriage celebrated with such grandeur remained fruitless? How could the womb of France's future queen remain empty when the nation demanded heirs? Every month that passed brought new murmurs. Every letter from Vienna carried reminders from her mother, the Empress Maria Theresa, urging her to do what seemed beyond her power. It was not merely a matter of family pride. Dynasties balanced on such matters. Alliances trembled on the edge of childlessness. And so the young Antoinette, still scarcely more than a girl, bore the weight of France's future upon her body, a burden that grew heavier with each passing year. Her husband Louis, shy and hesitant, retreated into his own world of keys and hunting, reluctant or unable to bridge the gap between them. Physicians were called, advice was offered, remedies suggested. Some whispered that his reluctance was physical, others that it was of the spirit. Yet the blame fell not upon him, but upon her. She was foreign, she was frivolous, she was blamed for what she could not change. It is always easier to condemn the visible than to probe the hidden. One can imagine her sitting in her chambers, gazing upon the tiny garments embroidered in anticipation, her fingers brushing over fabric meant for children who did not come. Outside, the sounds of laughter, of music, of footsteps on marble floors never ceased. But within, she sat quietly, caught between duty and despair. Did she weep in solitude, or did she smile even to herself, denying the sorrow that threatened to consume her? We cannot know. The records of history preserve the judgments, not the private tears. In letters to her mother, she promised obedience, expressed hope, sought forgiveness. And in reply, her mother's words were stern, practical, reminding her of her duty, urging her to win her husband's affection, to charm him, to secure the dynasty. Maria Theresa was no stranger to the burden of rule, but perhaps she did not see that her daughter was too young, too uncertain, too fragile to carry such weight alone. Thus the Dauphine's heart was torn between filial obedience and her own unspoken fears. The court, restless for spectacle, turned her childlessness into theater. Satirical pamphlets spread through Paris. Cruel caricatures painted her as barren, as cold, as unfit. In salons, her name was spoken with derision, her role reduced to failure. To be a queen without children was to be seen as a hollow shell, beautiful perhaps, but empty within. Such judgments ignored her youth, her humanity, her innocence. But Versailles did not forgive weakness, and the people beyond the gates hungered not only for bread, but for symbols upon which to lay their grievances. And yet, amid the cruel scrutiny, she sought escape. She played cards late into the night, laughter masking the silence of her chambers. She danced, her movements light as though to defy the heaviness of expectation. She found solace in companions, in the ease of youth, in moments that allowed her to forget the weight of empty cradles. Perhaps she tried to convince herself that she was still simply a girl, not yet bound entirely by destiny. But the truth pressed upon her more each day. She was no longer Antonia of Vienna, carefree in gardens of lilacs. She was Marie Antoinette, Dauphine of France, and France demanded more than laughter. How does one live when one's body becomes the stage upon which nations watch? Can a heart remain light when judged not for its feelings, but for its failure to produce heirs? Perhaps in those years she began to sense that her life would never belong to herself. Every gesture, every smile, every silence was interpreted, dissected, reshaped into meaning she had not intended. Even her womb, empty and silent, was no longer hers, but France's disappointment. Time passed, and with each year the whispers grew sharper, the pamphlets crueler. She became impatient with her husband, pressing him, urging him, though her words may have carried desperation rather than reproach. And when at last intervention came, Whether by physician's hand or by the slow awakening of a timid husband, the union was finally consummated. The silence was broken, though not immediately with the cry of a child. Yet the moment was too late to erase the years of mockery, too late to silence the cruel laughter that had already shaped her reputation. When, at last, she bore children, the joy was tempered by memory. The cradles, once empty, now held life, but the scars of rumor could not be undone. For by then, her image had already hardened in the eyes of many. She was the frivolous queen, the foreigner, the careless girl who danced while the kingdom waited. Reality mattered less than the legend already growing around her. Even as she held her infants, even as candlelight finally flickered across occupied cradles, the whispers of her earlier years lingered like shadows that refused to lift. Thus her childless years were not merely a pause in dynastic succession. They were the foundation upon which her later downfall was built. For in that silence, in those empty cradles, France learned to see her not as a girl struggling in youth and uncertainty, but as a queen who failed her duty. And though she later fulfilled it, history had already written its judgment. At night, when all was still, when the vast palace grew silent save for the faint murmur of fountains beyond the walls, she may have sat by a cradle, watching candlelight dance across a sleeping child's face, and wondered whether love could protect them from the destiny already looming. And perhaps, in the soft glow, she sensed that nothing was ever truly given at Versailles without a price. The candle flame flickered once more, and the cradle stood waiting, filled with life at last, yet surrounded by shadows that stretched longer than the dawn. The cradle that once stood empty now held life, yet the shadows around it did not retreat, for in the silence of Versailles, another kind of sound grew louder. The hiss of rumor, the scratching of quills across paper, the thrum of printing presses in Paris. In taverns and salons, in narrow alleys and bright chambers, her name was reshaped again and again, until Marie Antoinette ceased to be a woman and became instead a figure woven of scandal and imagination. Her laughter at cards, her silken gowns, her walks through gardens, all were twisted into tales that fed a restless nation, hungering not only for bread but for someone to blame. The pamphlets, known as libelles, multiplied like shadows, carrying images of her drawn with cruelty, her body caricatured, her character slandered. They accused her of extravagance, of licentiousness, of secret lovers and wasted fortunes. The truth mattered little. What mattered was that the people, hearing such whispers repeated often enough, began to believe them. Each new rumor spread faster than the last, until her name itself became a symbol of decadence. She was no longer the young queen who had wept at her empty cradle. She was Madame Deficit, a phrase sharper than steel, branding her as the cause of all that ailed France. One can imagine her sitting in her chambers, receiving news of these pamphlets, her face tightening, her hands trembling as she tried to laugh them off. Perhaps she told herself that such slander was beneath her notice, that the dignity of a queen could not be pierced by cheap ink and cruel drawings. Yet the sting must have lingered, for words, though intangible, can wound more deeply than any blade. And in Versailles, where image was power, the distortion of her image meant the erosion of her very throne. The court itself was divided, some seeking her favor, others resenting her presence. Her foreign birth was never forgotten. To many she remained the Austrian woman, the outsider, the intruder who had been imposed upon France by politics rather than love. In salons where philosophy was debated, her name was invoked as an emblem of monarchy's corruption. How strange it must have been for her to live amid splendor, to walk beneath chandeliers heavy with crystal, while knowing that beyond the palace gates she was despised, that even her laughter was taken as proof of her indifference to suffering. And yet she did laugh. She played cards deep into the night, wagering sums that seemed vast to those who barely afforded bread. She wore gowns of silk and jewels that glittered in candlelight, not out of malice, but out of habit, for Versailles was a stage where such display was expected. A queen could no more appear in plain garb than a star could step unadorned upon a stage. But the people outside saw not custom, but extravagance, not ritual, but waste. The distance between perception and reality widened with every passing season. Among the cruelest rumors were those that touched her honor as a wife and mother. Whispers accused her of lovers, of betrayals, of vices that filled scandalous pages. She, who had once endured years of humiliation for her childless state, now found herself condemned for supposed excess in passion. The contradictions mattered little. Scandal thrived not on truth, but on hunger, and the hunger of the people for stories about their queen seemed insatiable. Her name appeared in verses, in songs sung in marketplaces, in crude drawings passed from hand to hand. Each time, the image grew darker until she was painted as both frivolous and dangerous, both careless and corrupt. The woman who had once been a child of Vienna, who had played harp in candlelit chambers, now became to the public a monster draped in silks, laughing while they starved. The myth was born, and myths, once loosed, rarely die. What must she have thought, hearing of these stories, knowing that her image had escaped her grasp, that she could no longer define herself, but was instead defined by others? Perhaps she walked through her gardens at the Petit Trianon, her sanctuary beyond the rigid formality of Versailles, and wondered if the air there, filled with the scent of grass and blossoms, could ever wash away the poison of rumor. In that small estate, she dressed simply, played at being a shepherdess, sought a life of ease away from court. To her, it was escape, a brief return to innocence. To others, it became proof of her indifference, her mockery of the peasantry. Even her attempts at freedom were turned against her. Thus the sound of printing presses echoed more loudly than the music of Versailles. The ink upon cheap paper carried more weight than the proclamations of kings. In the streets of Paris, her face was no longer that of a young mother, but of a villainess in the popular imagination. And each whisper, each caricature, each pamphlet edged her closer to the fate that awaited her. Here, one might pause and ask, is it possible for truth to survive when rumor becomes more vivid than reality? Can a queen, or any person, reclaim their image once it has been stolen, painted over by the hands of countless others? Perhaps the answer lies not in history, but in silence. For the silence of the queen in her chambers, confronted with shadows she could not disperse, speaks more loudly than the words of any pamphlet. At night, when the palace grew quiet and only the faint hiss of wind pressed against the windows, she may have listened to the distant hum of Paris beyond the gates, a city restless, murmuring, alive with voices she could not hear directly, but which shaped her destiny nonetheless. She may have thought of Vienna, where music had once filled her ears instead of slander, where laughter had not yet been poisoned by judgment. But the sound that lingered was not music, not laughter, not even her child's breathing from the cradle. It was the rustle of paper, of pamphlets spreading through the city, of words sharper than daggers, words that could not be recalled once spoken. The presses did not rest, and neither did rumor. Each new dawn brought fresh slander, and each dusk carried the echoes further. The queen's image dissolved into shadow, her true self hidden beneath layers of lies and invention. Versailles still glittered, its mirrors still multiplied her reflection, but what stared back at her was no longer her own face. The candlelight in her chamber trembled, and the shadows danced along the walls, whispering like the pages of pamphlets turning in the wind. The candlelight trembled on the walls of Versailles, its shadows whispering like the turning pages of pamphlets, and in those restless murmurs the queen sought escape. The shadows followed her through the galleries, through the endless rituals, through the perfumed halls where nothing was private and everything was judged. Yet beyond the main palace there lay a refuge, a smaller world carved within the vast estate, a place where she believed she might breathe without the weight of eyes upon her. This was the Petit Trianon, a modest palace compared to the grandeur of Versailles. But to Marie Antoinette it was a sanctuary, a fragment of freedom amid the gilded prison of monarchy. There, the air was gentler, scented not with layers of powder and perfume, but with grass, blossoms, and the damp sweetness of earth after rain. The fountain still murmured, yet the murmur was softer, less demanding than those of Versailles. The walls, though adorned, did not gleam with the intimidating gold of the great palace. It was here that she gathered companions she trusted, here that she shed the weight of etiquette, here that she allowed herself to play at simplicity. To those who watched from afar, it seemed absurd. A queen dressed not in the silks of court, but in muslin gowns, pretending to be a shepherdess, tending to gardens and animals as though she were a country maiden. To the people of Paris, hungry and weary, such play appeared as mockery, as insult. They did not see the queen's yearning for innocence, her desperate need for moments unmeasured by ritual. They saw only extravagance disguised as simplicity, luxury transformed into theater. Even her refuge became a weapon turned against her. But within the Petit Trianon, she may have felt something that Versailles never offered: solitude. The sound of sheep bells carried softly through the air, mingling with birdsong and the rustle of leaves. The children ran freely, their laughter carried over meadows that had been carefully designed to look natural, though every tree, every path, every pond had been planned. To Antoinette, the artifice was invisible. What mattered was the feeling of escape. She might walk barefoot upon the grass. She might sit beside a brook and hear the water's gentle song. She might taste a fruit plucked directly from a tree. Such small things, so trivial to most, were to her a taste of freedom, a return to something she had lost when she left Vienna. Inside, the rooms of the Petit Trianon were intimate, their scale human rather than overwhelming. Candles glowed with warmth rather than brilliance, and the silence was not filled with the rustle of courtiers' gowns or the endless drone of etiquette. Here she could read, she could play music, she could laugh without calculation. The harp, once a companion of her childhood, filled the air again with gentle notes, reminding her of Vienna's softer days. Perhaps she sang quietly to herself, a voice no longer demanded by ceremony, but free to tremble, to waver, to belong to no one but her. And yet freedom was an illusion. The Petit Trianon was not far enough from Versailles to silence the gossip. Courtiers resented her retreat, for she excluded them from her circle. Pamphleteers mocked her simplicity, painting her as a woman detached from reality, a queen who dressed as a shepherdess while her people starved. What she saw as innocence was seen by others as insult. The more she sought refuge, the more she alienated herself from the court and the people. Still, she returned again and again, for where else could she go? The palace was suffocating, Paris was hostile, and her homeland was gone. In the meadows of the Trianon she could walk slowly, her hands brushing tall grasses, her eyes lifted to a sky that belonged to no king, no court, no pamphlet. In that sky she may have sought solace, imagining that somewhere beyond it the voices of Vienna still lingered, the laughter of her sisters, the music of her youth. The sheep bells faded into the distance as evening fell. The sky turned from gold to violet, the air grew cool, and lanterns were lit along pathways that wound gently toward the small palace. Inside, Candles glowed with softer light than Versailles, and the queen sat quietly, her children near, her companions close. For a few hours, perhaps, she felt at peace, as though the world beyond the gates did not exist, as though the rumors and scandals were shadows belonging to another life. But shadows do not remain outside. They follow, silent and persistent, slipping beneath doors, clinging to garments, whispering in the corners even of sanctuaries. And so the Petit Trianon, for all its charm, could not protect her. What was meant as a retreat became itself a stage. Another reason for the people to despise her, another symbol twisted against her. To them, the muslin gowns were not innocence but mockery, the sheep not simplicity but pretense, the gardens not refuge but waste. In the echo of sheep bells they heard not peace but insult. Thus the sanctuary became another prison, though its bars were softer, its chains invisible. And the queen, who longed for a space where she could be merely human, discovered that no such space existed for her. She was always the queen, always watched, always judged. Even when she tried to step outside her role, she carried it with her, as inseparable as her own shadow. Night deepened at the Petit Trianon. The air cooled, the sheep bells stilled, the gardens grew quiet beneath the gaze of the moon. Within her chamber, the queen lay in a bed smaller than Versailles offered, its curtains drawn close. Perhaps she closed her eyes and imagined she was once again in Vienna, a child running through lilac-scented gardens, laughing freely, unburdened. But dawn would come, and with it the return of duties, of judgments, of shadows that could never be silenced. The last sound she heard before sleep may have been the faint chime of a bell carried on the night wind, its note fading into silence, unresolved, like her yearning for freedom. The faint chime of a bell drifted into silence, and in that quiet another sound emerged, sharper and more dangerous. The glint of a jewel catching unseen light. The whisper of diamonds passed from hand to hand, the beginning of a scandal that would cling to Marie Antoinette's name like a curse. The affair of the diamond necklace was not born of her desire, nor of her hand, and yet in the restless imagination of France, it became the proof of every rumor that had ever been whispered against her. The story began years before, when a grand necklace was commissioned by jewelers for Madame du Barry, mistress of Louis XVIII. The old king died before it could be delivered, leaving the necklace without an owner, its thousands of diamonds glittering uselessly, a fortune encased in metal and light. The jewelers, desperate to recover their investment, sought a buyer, but few in Europe could afford such extravagance. When their eyes turned toward the young queen, they found a tale waiting to be woven. For Marie Antoinette, already accused of frivolity and waste, became in their minds the perfect figure to be entangled in a web of deceit. A woman named Jeanne de la Motte wove herself into the plot, claiming to act on behalf of the queen. Through intrigue and deception, she convinced Cardinal de Rohan, a man eager to return to royal favor, that he was aiding the queen in secret, arranging for the purchase of the necklace as proof of her gratitude. Letters were forged, meetings staged in shadowed gardens, illusions spun with skillful cruelty. The cardinal, blinded by ambition, believed himself chosen to restore himself to Antoinette's trust, and in that belief he fell into the trap. When the scheme unraveled, the necklace vanished, the fraud exposed, but the stain of suspicion did not fall upon Jeanne or the jewelers, or even the credulous cardinal. It fell upon the queen. Though she had played no part, though her innocence was clear to those who examined the facts, the people of Paris did not care for facts. They cared for the story, and the story was that their queen had sought to possess a fortune in jewels while they themselves starved. The image was irresistible. a queen draped in diamonds, laughing at the hunger of her people, squandering the wealth of a nation upon her vanity. It mattered little that she had refused the necklace when it was offered, that she had spoken against such waste. The pamphlets did not print her innocence, they printed her guilt. Caricatures showed her grasping for jewels. Her name was tied forever to the scandal, and truth was buried beneath ink and rumor. One can imagine her sitting in her chamber when the news reached her, her face pale, her hands tightening as she realized that once again she was powerless against the storm of words. She had not asked for the diamonds, had not touched them, had not even seen them, yet her name was the one whispered in taverns, cursed in markets, mocked in salons. Innocence offered no protection. For once a symbol is chosen, it is no longer flesh and blood but myth, and myths obey not truth but desire. The trial that followed was another theater. The cardinal, humiliated, sought to save himself by allowing suspicion to linger upon her. Jeanne de la Motte, cunning and shameless, spread her accusations with glee. The jewelers insisted upon their losses, eager to find blame. And through it all, Marie Antoinette was forced to watch as her reputation, already fragile, was shattered further. When the court acquitted the cardinal, when the crowd cheered his supposed vindication, it was not justice that triumphed, but rumor. For the people believed that he had been saved from a queen's cruelty, that his freedom proved her guilt. The affair of the diamond necklace became a turning point, a moment when perception hardened into certainty. To the people, she was no longer merely frivolous. She was corrupt, deceitful, a symbol of monarchy's excess and decay. The phrase, Madame Deficit, gained new life, whispered with venom, painted upon walls, printed in countless libels. No denial could undo the image of the queen adorned in stolen jewels, for once such a vision enters the imagination of a people, it cannot be erased. And yet, behind the glittering shadow of diamonds, the queen was still a woman who had sought only peace in her gardens, who had longed for her children, who had laughed to cover her unease. The diamonds never touched her neck, yet they cut more deeply than any blade, for they sliced through the last threads of trust between queen and people. Perhaps she walked again in the meadows of the Petit Trianon, the sound of sheep bells in her ears, her gaze upon the quiet sky, and wondered how it was possible that lies could weigh heavier than truth, that stones she had never worn could press upon her like chains. The grass beneath her feet was real. The breeze against her face was real. Her children's laughter was real. But in Paris, the only reality that mattered was the image of a queen who coveted diamonds while her people starved. Night descended, and the jewels of the sky appeared one by one. She may have lifted her eyes to them, diamonds untouchable, scattered across the heavens without cost or scandal. But even those distant lights may have seemed poisoned, for jewels had become her curse, symbols of her downfall, and as the cool air pressed around her, she may have heard again the faint echo of a crowd, cheering not her name, but the freedom of a cardinal. A cheer that sounded more like a verdict than applause. The jewel glinted still, unseen but unforgettable, its light casting shadows far beyond the court, shadows that would one day stretch all the way to the guillotine. The jewel that glinted in shadow faded, but in its place another sound grew louder, more insistent, more devastating than scandal. It was not the murmur of courtiers or the hiss of pamphlets. It was the growl of empty stomachs, the restless shuffle of a hungry people moving through the streets of Paris. Beyond the gilded gates of Versailles, where fountains danced in endless symmetry and banquets stretched across long tables, the people of France endured winters of want, summers of scarcity, and the bitter taste of bread that grew more costly with each passing season. Hunger, unlike rumor, could not be dismissed with laughter, nor silenced with denial. Hunger gnawed without rest, and it carried within it the seeds of revolution. The kingdom was strained by debts, wars fought across oceans, fortunes spent upon causes far from home. The harvests faltered, the price of grain soared, and bread, daily bread, the staff of life, slipped from the reach of those who needed it most. In villages and cities alike, the ovens grew cold, the stalls empty, the children thin. Mothers looked upon their families with despair, their hands empty of food, their hearts heavy with helplessness. And in this silence of want, voices rose, searching for blame. They did not need to look far. The name of their queen, already blackened by pamphlets, became the vessel into which their anger poured. Inside Versailles, the air was sweet with perfume, heavy with the scents of roasts and sauces, sugared delicacies arranged in abundance. The queen dined beneath chandeliers where 100 candles shone, while music played softly in the background. She did not think herself cruel. Such banquets were not of her choosing, but of tradition, ritual as ingrained as the rising of the sun. Yet beyond the gates, men and women looked upon such excess with rage. To them, the sight of a queen feasting while they starved was not custom, but insult. Each morsel upon the royal table became in their minds bread stolen from their mouths. The contrast could not have been sharper. The shimmering light of Versailles against the dim lanterns of Paris streets, the rustle of silk against the tattered cloth of beggars, the glitter of jewels against hollowed eyes. Even if Marie Antoinette had emptied her own plate, had given her own bread to the people, it would not have undone the image already etched into their minds. She was the symbol of plenty, while they knew only want, and symbols are more enduring than reality. Her mother in Vienna had once warned her, "The love of a people is not won by splendor, but by prudence, not by display, but by care." Yet prudence was foreign to Versailles, a place where ceremony demanded abundance, where a queen was judged not by her simplicity, but by her magnificence. To appear modest was to risk seeming unworthy. To appear generous was to risk seeming weak. And so, caught in the endless theater of monarchy, she played the part expected of her, even as it deepened the hatred beyond the gates. Pamphlets sharpened the wound, painting her as the cause of deficit, the heart of extravagance. Madame Deficit, they called her, as though she alone had drained the coffers, as though the wars, the debts, the mismanagement of generations could be laid upon her slender shoulders. The hunger of the people was turned into anger against the queen, and each empty loaf became in their imagination a jewel upon her neck. Each child's hunger, a card tossed upon her gaming table. What must she have felt, hearing of this hatred? Perhaps she walked through the hall of mirrors, her reflection multiplied 100 times, and in each reflection she saw not herself, but the distorted image the people carried of her. Careless, selfish, wasteful. Perhaps she stood at a window, looking out upon the distant horizon, knowing that beyond it lay men and women cursing her name, though she had never seen their faces. Hunger builds walls as impenetrable as stone, and no words could pass through them. And yet, within her own heart, she was not indifferent. She wept for her children when they fell ill. She fretted over debts. She worried over the whispers that reached her ears. But what is a private tear against the public cry of a city? What is a mother's concern against the hunger of thousands? Her humanity, so real in the quiet of her chamber, dissolved in the glare of rumor and rage. The bread riots began, women shouting in markets, men muttering in taverns. The cries carried upward, spreading through the city, gathering strength. At Versailles, the fountains continued to murmur, the candles continued to glow, but beyond, a storm was building. And though she may not have heard it clearly, though the sounds were muffled by distance and luxury, the storm was already moving toward her, step by step, hunger by hunger, rumor by rumor. At night, as she lay beneath embroidered canopies, perhaps she dreamed of Vienna, where bread had once seemed abundant, where she had been only a child with no thought of deficits or debts. She may have remembered the sweetness of cakes, the scent of pastries in her youth, innocent delights unshadowed by politics. And yet in Paris, those very images became twisted into the cruelest of accusations. Let them eat cake, a phrase she never spoke, but which echoed louder than truth. Hunger transforms even silence into insult, and so her innocence was drowned beneath the roar of want. The sound of empty stomachs echoed louder than music, louder than fountains, louder than the rustle of gowns. It was a sound that no palace could silence, a sound that grew each day until it filled the air of France, pressing against the gates of Versailles like a tide. And in that tide, the queen herself would soon be swept, for hunger does not pause, does not forgive, does not wait for explanation. Hunger demands, and when demands are unmet, it devours. In the distance, faint and persistent, the sound of footsteps began to accompany the growl of empty stomachs, footsteps moving toward the palace, carrying with them the restless energy of a nation no longer willing to endure. The footsteps in the distance grew louder, echoing through the restless air of France, and within those footsteps, words also marched, words that would cling to Marie Antoinette more tightly than jewels, more stubbornly than rumor. Among them, none would prove so enduring, so poisonous, as the phrase she never spoke, "Let them eat cake." It was said to have been her reply upon hearing that her people had no bread, a sentence both cruel and careless, a dismissal of hunger wrapped in arrogance. Yet the truth is simple. She never uttered those words. They came from the writings of philosophers, from stories told long before her, yet history, eager for symbols, placed them in her mouth. And once there, they could never be removed. How strange that words unspoken can outlive words sincerely meant. Her letters, her pleas, her worries have faded in memory, yet the phrase endures, repeated across centuries as if it were proof of her heart. In it, the people saw all they wished to see, a queen indifferent to suffering, a foreigner mocking their hunger, a woman gilded in luxury while children starved. The truth that she wept in private, that she sought solace in her children's laughter, that she worried over debts and duties, could not compete with the simplicity of that phrase. For truth is complex, but myth is sharp, and sharpness cuts more deeply. Perhaps she heard whispers of it, even in her own time. The cruel words passed through salons, muttered in taverns, sung in satirical songs. Perhaps she tried to deny them, to dismiss them, to laugh at their absurdity. Yet how does one fight a sentence that was never spoken? To deny it is to repeat it. To protest, it is to give it life. Silence, too, gives it strength, for silence is taken as guilt. Thus she was trapped, condemned by a phrase not her own, bound to a legend that belonged not to her lips, but to the hunger and anger of a people searching for blame. It is worth pausing to wonder, how many lives have been judged not by truth, but by rumor, not by action, but by words attributed unjustly? How many reputations crumble not under the weight of what was done, but under the shadow of what was believed? Marie Antoinette became the embodiment of this cruel paradox. She lived a life of splendor, yes, but also of loneliness, of longing, of constant scrutiny. Yet all of that is overshadowed by a sentence never uttered, a phrase that reduced her to caricature, that made her a symbol of cruelty rather than a woman caught in history's storm. And still, Versailles glittered. The queen walked through halls of mirrors, attended balls where music soared and violins wept, dined beneath the glow of chandeliers. Each gesture, each smile, each gown seemed to confirm the myth. To the people, It mattered little that such splendor was demanded by tradition, that to appear less magnificent would have been scandalous in itself. They saw only the contrast, their empty stomachs against her feasts, their rags against her silks, their hunger against her jewels. And when the phrase, "let them eat cake," spread, it crystallized that contrast into words that could not be forgotten. In her private chambers, perhaps she sighed at the futility of it, the endless gulf between perception and reality. She may have whispered to herself that she had never said such a thing, that her heart was not as cold as the rumors claimed. She may have pressed her lips against the soft hair of her children, seeking comfort in their innocence, reminding herself that within her family she was still loved, still human. Yet beyond the palace, her humanity no longer existed. She was no longer Marie Antoinette, the girl from Vienna, the mother, the wife. She was only the queen who mocked hunger, the woman of the phrase. The false words traveled faster than truth, carried on sheets of cheap paper, sung in streets, painted in cruel drawings. They entered the imagination of France, and once there they became fact, immovable, unchallenged. Even centuries later, when historians comb through records, when evidence is laid bare, the phrase endures, still repeated as if it were hers. Such is the power of myth. It survives even when truth is revealed, for myth satisfies the hunger of the mind as bread satisfies the hunger of the body. The queen's fate was sealed not only by politics and hunger, but by perception. And perception is shaped as much by words as by deeds. Let them eat cake became a guillotine long before the blade was forged, cutting her away from compassion, from sympathy, from any possibility of redemption in the eyes of her people. She was condemned not only for what she did, but for what she never said. At night, as the palace grew still, she may have sat by a window, gazing out upon the vast gardens of Versailles, their fountains glimmering faintly in moonlight. The air was cool, scented with damp grass, the sky above vast and indifferent. She may have wondered whether the people she ruled would ever see her as she truly was, or whether she was already lost to the shadow of a phrase. Did she imagine voices chanting it in the distance, carried on the wind from Paris, echoing louder than truth itself? Did she hear in the rustle of leaves the mockery of words she never spoke? The footsteps of the hungry grew nearer, joined now by voices, by cries that demanded more than bread, that demanded change. The queen, bound in the myths woven around her, could not silence them, could not answer them, could not escape them. For once a people have found a symbol for their suffering. They do not let it go. The night deepened, and the fountains murmured on, their waters glittering in moonlight like silver threads. But beneath their gentle song, another sound lingered. The steady march of voices growing stronger, the cry of hunger turning into the cry of revolution. And within those voices, whether spoken or not, the phrase pulsed like a drumbeat, untrue, unjust, yet unstoppable. The voices that carried the cruel phrase swelled into something larger, deeper, and far more dangerous than rumor. What began as murmurs of hunger became cries in the streets, cries that gathered force until they rolled like thunder through Paris. The summer of 1789 bore witness to the moment when whispers of discontent turned into shouts of revolt, when the old order trembled beneath the weight of a people who could no longer be silenced. The Bastille, an ancient fortress of stone and shadow, became the symbol of that cry. And when its gates were stormed, when its walls crumbled before the fury of a crowd, the world itself seemed to split open. From the windows of Versailles, the queen could not hear the clash of steel upon stone, nor the roar of a mob as they dragged down a symbol of tyranny. Yet news traveled swiftly, carried by horse and messenger, by rumor and fear. Within the gilded halls, the courtiers whispered more urgently than ever, their faces pale, their voices low, their eyes darting as though the revolution itself might burst through the palace doors. The air grew heavy with unease, as if the chandeliers trembled with each distant shout. Marie Antoinette, still draped in silks, still bound to rituals, faced a world she could scarcely comprehend. She had been raised to see monarchy as eternal, as solid as marble, and as enduring as the sun. Yet now, in the streets of Paris, the people declared that no throne was unshakable, no crown untouchable. The Bastille fell not only in stone, but in meaning. It was the first shout of a revolution that would not be contained, and its echoes reached even into the Queen's private chambers. What must she have felt hearing the news? Perhaps disbelief, perhaps dread, perhaps the faint hope that this storm, like others, would pass. But the storm did not pass. It gathered, fed by hunger, by anger, by years of resentment. The pamphlets that had mocked her now seemed almost gentle compared to the fury that burned in the streets. The people demanded not merely bread, but change, and their shouts carried with them the force of a tide too vast to resist. At night, Versailles still glittered. Candles still burned, music still played, courtiers still bowed. Yet beneath the surface, fear coiled like a serpent. Each sound of wind at the window seemed sharper, each distant murmur more threatening. The Queen, once the symbol of splendor, was now the symbol of oppression. The people no longer saw her as a woman, but as the embodiment of monarchy itself, and monarchy was what they sought to tear down. The storming of the Bastille marked the beginning, but it was not the end. The shouts spread outward into villages and towns, into fields where peasants now rose against the weight of feudal dues, into the very air of France. Fires burned in barns and manors. Voices cried out for freedom, for equality, for vengeance. The revolution had begun, and nothing, no ritual, no crown, no silken gown could halt its march. The Queen, in her gilded chambers, may have walked to a mirror and gazed upon her reflection, seeing not herself, but the shadow the people had cast upon her. She may have wondered if any gesture could undo the hatred, if any word could quiet the fury. Yet the truth was bitter. Once a crowd begins to shout, once their voices rise as one, no single voice, not even a queen's, can silence them. The palace of Versailles, once the proud heart of France, now seemed almost vulnerable. Its vast gardens, its endless galleries, its gilded gates were no longer symbols of strength, but of distance. For outside, the people suffered and shouted, while inside the Queen still walked beneath chandeliers. The contrast was too sharp, too cruel, and in that contrast lay her downfall. The cries of Paris reached her like an echo through corridors of marble. They spoke of liberty, of rights, of vengeance against those who had for too long lived in splendor, while others starved. And though she had not chosen her fate, though she had not written the debts or commanded the wars, she was the face the people saw. It is easier to blame a person than a system, easier to tear down a queen than to unravel centuries of monarchy. As the summer waned, the air grew heavy, not only with heat, but with unrest. In the salons of Paris, men debated the rights of man, the end of privilege, the rewriting of the very order of the world. In taverns, voices grew louder, coarser, filled with anger. In the countryside, fires burned against the night sky. And in Versailles, candles flickered, their light fragile against the darkness, gathering beyond the gates. The Queen lay in her chamber, her children near, her husband withdrawn into silence. Outside, fountains murmured as they always had, their waters glittering in moonlight, indifferent to the tremors of revolution. But in the distance, beyond the stillness of the gardens, the people marched, their footsteps relentless. their shouts swelling into a roar that no palace could contain. The night carried with it the smell of smoke, faint yet distinct, drifting across fields toward Versailles. It mingled with the scent of roses in the gardens, a bitter reminder that beauty and ruin can share the same air. The queen may have lifted her head from her pillow, listening to the silence of the palace, and in that silence she may have heard the first true note of what was to come. Not rumor, not scandal, but the raw, uncontainable cry of a people who would no longer bow. And in that cry, though distant, though muffled by walls and gardens, she may have felt the first tremor of the blade that would one day fall, its shadow stretching already across her path. The roar of the people swelled beyond the palace gates, and with it came not only shouts but the pounding of fists, the tramp of feet, the thunder of a crowd that would no longer be held back by walls of gold. In October of 1789, the women of Paris, driven by hunger, by fury, by desperation, sharpened into resolve, rose and marched upon Versailles. The city had starved too long, the cries for bread had been ignored too often, and when the harvest failed once more, the patience of mothers snapped. With children clinging to their skirts, with hunger burning in their bellies, they took up whatever arms they could find, pikes, knives, muskets, and they poured out into the rain. The march began as a call for bread, yet it became something greater, something that no king or queen could ignore. Rain fell upon the cobblestones of Paris as the women shouted, their voices carrying through narrow streets, gathering more and more to their cause. Men joined them, some out of solidarity, some drawn by the momentum of revolution. The sound of drums beat against the air, the rhythm of their anger echoing like the very heartbeat of the city. And step by step, mile by mile, the procession grew until it was a river of bodies flowing toward Versailles. Inside the palace, the queen still walked beneath chandeliers, still heard music, still tried to live within the rituals of court. Yet the sound of the march could not be silenced. The pounding of feet grew nearer, like thunder rolling across the land. Courtiers whispered in fear, guards shifted uneasily, and the king, indecisive as always, faltered between retreat and resistance. But for the queen, the march was more than threat. It was revelation. The people no longer shouted from a distance. They came to her doors. The hunger she had heard of only in whispers, the anger she had known only through pamphlets, now pressed physically against her walls. The rain soaked the marchers, but their fury burned hotter than the storm. They carried banners, they carried blades, and above all they carried the weight of their children's empty stomachs. "Bread," they cried, "bread for our children, bread for Paris." The words rose like a chant, relentless, and in that chant the queen's name was entwined, cursed and mocked, as though she herself had stolen the loaves from their tables. She had not, but the truth mattered little. To the people, she was bread denied, and so they came to claim it. When they reached Versailles, the palace stood gleaming, its gardens ordered, its fountains still playing as though unaware of the storm pressing at its gates. But the people knew no awe, no hesitation. They surged forward, their voices echoing off the marble, their fists hammering against doors, their eyes fixed upon the windows where they imagined the queen stood. Within, courtiers ran, servants trembled, guards prepared. The air inside grew stifling with fear, as though the very walls could feel the weight of the crowd pressing against them. Marie Antoinette, caught within this tempest, faced the moment with a composure that surprised even her enemies. She was urged to flee, to hide, to retreat from the fury outside. Yet she stood her ground, pale but resolute, her eyes lifted, her voice steady. Later, when she stepped onto a balcony, her children at first beside her, she looked out upon the sea of angry faces, upon the blades and pikes, upon the mouths that shouted curses against her name. She had been taught to smile at courtiers, to charm with laughter, but now she could not smile. She could only stand silent, exposed, a woman before a nation's fury. The people demanded her children be removed from her side, for they would not allow innocence to shield her. She obeyed, sending them back inside, and when she returned alone to the balcony, the crowd fell momentarily silent. The rain dripped from her hair, her gown clung damp against her body, yet she stood unflinching, gazing upon them not as queen but as woman, mother, human. And for a fleeting moment the silence itself seemed an acknowledgement, a recognition of courage even from those who despised her. Some in the crowd, it is said, murmured admiration, but admiration is a fleeting spark, and the storm did not abate. The demands were made. The king and queen must leave Versailles, must come to Paris, must live where the people could see them, where they could no longer feast while others starved. And so, in a procession as surreal as it was grim, the royal family was escorted to the capital. The streets echoed with shouts, with drums, with laughter laced with menace. Ahead rolled carts filled with flour, behind marched soldiers and citizens, and in the midst of it all the royal carriage creaked slowly, carrying king, queen, and children toward a city that would no longer bow. The queen sat within, her children close, her eyes fixed upon the crowds that pressed around them, their faces wet with rain, their voices relentless. She, who had once ridden in triumph through gilded halls, now rode as prisoner of her people's hunger. The road to Paris was not long, but it was endless, each step of the horses accompanied by cries that pierced her heart. "Bread, bread," they shouted still, as though the very word could shatter the distance between ruler and ruled. And when, at last, they reached Paris, the Palace of Versailles was behind them forever. No longer would the queen wander through its mirrored halls. No longer would fountains murmur beneath her windows. The great symbol of monarchy had been abandoned, its splendor left behind like an empty shell. The queen was now bound to the Tuileries, a palace less grand, more prison than home, its walls echoing not with music, but with watchful silence. Versailles, with all its beauty, became memory, and the queen herself became captive to a nation she no longer ruled, but endured. The pounding on the doors of Versailles had ceased, yet in its place another sound rose, the constant murmur of Paris just beyond her windows, the ceaseless hum of a city restless and watchful. The queen who once dreamed of freedom in her gardens now found herself enclosed not by luxury, but by suspicion. And though she had stood bravely upon the balcony, though for one instant she had silenced the crowd with her presence, she knew that courage could not feed the hungry, nor undo the myths already written. Night fell upon Paris, and within the Tuileries the queen sat awake, her children asleep beside her. She listened to the distant rumble of the city, to the footsteps of guards in the corridors, to the faint creak of doors that no longer opened to friends but to captors. The rain that had fallen upon the marchers still lingered in the air, a damp chill that seeped into her bones. And she may have thought then of the fountains of Versailles, their waters forever playing, abandoned now, singing only to themselves. The pounding on the doors was gone, but in her memory it remained, unresolved, echoing still in the silence of her chamber. The pounding on the doors of Versailles had faded into memory, yet its echo still lingered in the queen's chest as she now sat confined within the walls of the Tuileries. The palace was not freedom, but gilded captivity, a cage surrounded not by golden mirrors, but by restless watchmen and the murmuring voice of Paris beyond its gates. Each day the people gathered outside, their presence a constant reminder that monarchy was no longer untouchable, that she and her family were prisoners in all but name. The sound of their voices seeped through stone walls, relentless, and with each cry the queen felt the walls close in tighter. It was in this suffocating silence that the plan for escape was born. The carriages were prepared in secrecy. The routes whispered in hushed tones, disguises arranged with desperate hope. To flee Paris was to flee captivity, to reach the safety of loyal troops, to gather strength enough to reclaim dignity. It was a plan as fragile as glass, dependent upon timing, upon trust, upon the uncertain mercy of chance. And yet, what other choice was left? To remain was to watch the monarchy dissolve day by day, to watch her children grow up under the eyes of those who despised them. To flee was to risk everything, but it was also to reach for hope, however faint. On that night in June of 1791, the family slipped quietly from the palace. The air was thick with summer warmth, heavy with the scent of dust and the faint hum of insects. Cloaks were drawn, wigs arranged, masks of anonymity assumed. The queen, once adorned in silks and jewels, now hid herself in plain garments, her children disguised as though they belonged to another life. The king, awkward in his false attire, seemed ill at ease, his broad frame betraying the pretense. Yet still they stepped into the waiting carriage, its wheels creaking softly as it rolled into the night. The city slept, but silence is never complete. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere, footsteps echoed in alleyways. Somewhere, a shadow lingered longer than it should have. The carriages rattled on, carrying not only passengers, but the weight of a crown's survival. Each turn of the wheels seemed to beat like a drum against the stillness. Each jolt over cobblestones, a reminder of how fragile freedom had become. Hour by hour, they traveled farther from Paris, the night deepening into dawn, the countryside opening before them, with fields silvered in moonlight. At times, the queen must have pressed her children close, whispering reassurances, though her own heart trembled. She may have gazed out of the small window, watching trees blur past, listening to the relentless clatter of wheels, imagining that each mile carried them closer to safety. Yet with each mile also came risk. Faces stared too long as they passed through villages, voices murmured questions, eyes recognized what disguises could not conceal. For a king and queen accustomed to being always seen could never truly vanish. In Varennes, the journey faltered. Recognition pierced the fragile mask, and whispers turned into certainty. These were no ordinary travelers. Suspicion thickened the air, and soon the carriages were halted, the illusion of escape shattered. The royal family was brought into the custody of local officials. Their flight ended not by armies, but by ordinary men who looked upon their passengers and saw not travelers, but monarchs in disguise. The sound of the carriage wheels ceased, and in that silence, the queen must have felt the crushing weight of fate closing in once more. The return to Paris was no longer a secret passage through the night, but a public humiliation. Crowds gathered along the roads, their eyes filled not with reverence but with fury. The royal carriages creaked forward slowly, prisoners now paraded before their people. Shouts pierced the air, curses flew, and the queen, who had once been met with bows and applause, now faced only contempt. Her children clung to her, frightened, their wide eyes reflecting the anger that surged around them. She held them close, her spine stiff with defiance, her face pale but resolute. If she could not shield them from the hatred, she could at least refuse to bow before it. Paris received them not as rulers, but as captives. The trust that had already been fragile now shattered completely. The people declared that their king and queen had abandoned them, had tried to flee their duty, had chosen to side with enemies beyond the borders rather than with the nation they were meant to serve. Whatever sympathy had remained evaporated like mist in the morning sun. They were no longer monarchs by divine right. They were traitors in the eyes of their people. In the chambers of the Tuileries, the queen sat once more behind barred windows, her gaze upon the city she could not escape. The sound of the carriage wheels still echoed in her mind, not as a promise of freedom, but as a reminder of failure. Each rattle, each creak, was the sound of a crown slipping further from her grasp. She may have asked herself whether the plan had ever been possible, whether escape was only an illusion born of desperation. Could fate have ever allowed them to flee, or was the carriage always destined to halt in Varennes, as if history itself had decreed it? The night after their return was heavy with silence, the city outside restless, the palace filled with watchful eyes. The queen lay awake, her children sleeping uneasily nearby, her thoughts circling like the wheels that had once carried her toward hope. Freedom had been within reach, and then it had dissolved like a dream upon waking. She closed her eyes, but in the darkness she could still see the faces of the crowd, hear their shouts, feel their contempt pressing against her like a storm that would never pass. The rattling of carriage wheels ceased, but in her memory they continued, unresolved, rolling endlessly through the corridors of her mind, carrying her not to safety, but deeper into captivity. The rattling of carriage wheels faded, leaving behind the stillness of confinement, and when the doors of the Tuileries closed behind the royal family, they closed not upon a palace but upon a prison. Though its chambers were broad, its ceilings high, and its windows wide, the air within was heavy with suspicion, thick with the constant presence of guards, whose footsteps echoed through corridors that had once known only courtiers. The barred windows turned dusk into a reminder, for each evening as the light dimmed and shadows stretched, the queen looked outward upon a city alive with voices, knowing she could not step beyond the walls that held her. The Tuileries, once a royal residence, had become a place of captivity. Its gardens were no longer retreats but enclosures, every path watched, every movement measured. Guards lined the gates, soldiers patrolled the grounds, and beyond crowds gathered daily to jeer, to stare, to remind the queen that her life was no longer her own. The palace had always been a stage, but now the performance was stripped of splendor. It was no longer music and ritual, but the endless theater of humiliation. Within the walls, Marie Antoinette clung to her children, who grew up too quickly in the shadow of revolution. She taught them to pray, to hold their heads high even as the world sought to bow them low. She braided their hair with hands that trembled, kissed their foreheads with lips that sought to hide fear. Their innocence was her last refuge, yet even that refuge was fragile, for the people demanded not only the queen's downfall, but the reshaping of the very monarchy itself. Each day brought new decrees, new restrictions, new losses. Her circle of friends dwindled, courtiers vanished, letters grew rarer. Isolation thickened around her like fog. The king, indecisive and heavy in spirit, withdrew into silence, his presence more shadow than strength. Decisions faltered, words failed, and the queen, though once accused of frivolity, became the more resolute figure, her will hardening against despair. She counseled, she wrote, she sought alliances beyond France's borders, hoping still for rescue, for intervention, for the possibility that her family might be saved. But with each passing week, such hope grew thinner, as though time itself conspired against her. Beyond the barred windows, Paris roared. The city that had once celebrated royal processions now swarmed with anger. Pamphlets multiplied, their words cruel, their images vile. Crowds gathered not to cheer but to curse, their voices carrying upward into the queen's chamber, mingling with the cries of her children. Each shout struck her like a blow, yet she stood before the windows, refusing to flinch, refusing to give the mob the satisfaction of her fear. She had been raised to wear crowns, but now she wore defiance, and defiance became her last ornament. Still, the isolation aided her. The endless watchfulness, the absence of privacy, the constant reminder that her life was no longer hers, all of this pressed upon her like a stone upon the chest. At night, when the palace quieted, when guards' footsteps grew softer, she lay awake staring into darkness, her thoughts circling endlessly. She remembered Vienna, the soft music of her childhood, the laughter of sisters now far away. She remembered Versailles, its fountains and chandeliers, its rituals and splendor, and she saw how far she had fallen, how quickly the gilded stage had crumbled into this bare, suffocating prison. Her enemies called her heartless, careless, extravagant, yet in those nights she was only a mother, a wife, a woman stripped of freedom, longing for the world she had lost. She whispered prayers into the darkness, not for herself, but for her children, that they might be spared the cruelty of the storm now raging. But the storm had no mercy, and mercy was no longer part of the world that surrounded her. The barred windows at dusk became her horizon. She watched the light fade over Paris rooftops, the sky painted in red and violet, the city below restless, its hum unceasing. She could not step into that city, yet it pressed against her at every moment, demanding, accusing, condemning. She was trapped between walls and voices, between the silence of her chambers and the noise of revolution. And as each day ended, she felt the dusk settle heavier, as though the light itself had grown weary of her sorrow. The Tuileries was a palace in name only. In truth, it was a cage, a reminder that crowns can be stripped as easily as garments, that queens can become prisoners as swiftly as rumors spread. And within its walls, the queen's life narrowed to a handful of rooms, to the embraces of her children, to the letters she managed to send in secret, to the prayers whispered against darkness. Yet, even in captivity, she carried herself with dignity. She walked with head high, her words calm, her gaze steady. She knew the eyes upon her sought weakness, and she would not give it. If she must endure humiliation, she would endure it with defiance. If she must be prisoner, she would be prisoner as queen. And in that defiance lay the faint flicker of something that neither bars nor guards could extinguish, a will unbroken, a spirit that refused to bow even as the world turned against her. Outside, dusk deepened into night, the city lights flickering like restless stars. The queen remained at her window, watching, listening, her silhouette framed against the fading glow. The barred windows cut the sky into fragments, but through them she still sought the horizon, as though somewhere beyond the iron she might glimpse a glimmer of hope. Yet the iron held, the dusk thickened, and the silence of imprisonment settled once more, unresolved, heavy as stone, as the barred windows of the Tuileries cast dusk into fragments, and in those fragments the queen sat, listening not only to the hum of Paris, but to the silence of her husband. Louis, once king by divine right, now lived as though already defeated, his spirit dulled by hesitation, his words faltering, his presence fading. And then came the sound that would mark the final unraveling of monarchy, the roll of drums echoing through Paris, the drums of execution. They pounded not with the rhythm of ceremony, but with the heavy march of death, announcing to the city and to the world that the King of France was to die. On that January morning of 1793, the air was bitter, the sky overcast, as though the heavens themselves withdrew their warmth. The streets filled with thousands, their breath rising like smoke in the cold air, their eyes fixed upon the scaffold erected at the Place de la Revolution. The drums thundered, drowning out all words, for silence might allow doubt, and doubt might weaken resolve. The king was brought forth, his hands bound, his face pale yet calm. He spoke briefly, his voice carrying faintly through the roar, proclaiming his innocence, his forgiveness. But the drums rose again, silencing him, as though even his last words could not be permitted to live. The blade fell, swift and final, and the crowd erupted in a roar that shook the air. The head of Louis Capet, once king, was lifted high, crimson dripping against gray sky, and Paris shouted not in grief but in triumph. In that moment, monarchy itself seemed to die, its sanctity severed as brutally as flesh. And in the Tuileries, the queen became a widow, her children fatherless. Her world collapsed into a silence so deep it seemed to consume even her breath. What must she have felt confined in her chamber as the distant drums reached her ears? Did she know the exact moment when the blade fell, when the man who had been her husband, her companion in duty, her partner in suffering, was no more? Perhaps she closed her eyes, gripping the hands of her children, feeling in their small fingers the last thread that bound her to hope. Perhaps she whispered his name, unheard by the crowds, unheard by history, spoken only into the silence of her room. For the queen, who had once been accused of coldness toward her husband, now bore the grief of widowhood with a weight only she could measure. The city rejoiced, but in her chamber, grief was private, raw, unyielding. She had lost not only a husband but a shield, however fragile, against the storm. Now she stood alone, marked not as queen but as the widow of a condemned king, and widowhood in revolution was no sanctuary. It was another step toward her own destruction. Her children clung to her, their eyes wide with confusion, their voices asking questions she could not answer. What words can explain to a child that their father has been killed by his own people? She held them, kissed them, whispered reassurances that her own heart could not believe. In their innocence lay her only reason to endure, yet even that innocence was threatened, for the revolution would not spare them long. The days that followed were thick with sorrow, the palace colder than ever, the guards' footsteps heavier, the whispers more cruel. Each night as she lay awake, she must have heard again the roll of the drums, their sound looping endlessly in her memory, marking time not by hours but by loss. She may have replayed their final moments together, the silence they shared, the unspoken words that passed between them in glances, in touches, in the quiet bond of those who knew the end was near. And yet, amid grief, she stood with dignity. She did not collapse before her captors, did not weep where they could see, did not allow the mob the satisfaction of her despair. She wore her widowhood as she had once worn her crown, with a calm that defied humiliation. To the revolutionaries, she was no longer queen, no longer Antoinette. She was the Widow Capet, a title meant to strip her of rank, to reduce her to nothing. But within, she clung still to her identity, to the dignity of a queen, to the memory of a husband now silenced forever. The city moved on as cities always do, its hunger still gnawing, its voices still demanding, its fury still unspent. But for her, time seemed to still, to linger upon that morning when drums drowned out words, when the blade fell, when history itself seemed to tremble. Widowhood pressed upon her not only with grief, but with foreboding, for she knew now that her own path would lead inevitably to the same scaffold. The revolution would not rest until her blood, too, mingled with that of her husband in the square. At night, when the children finally slept, their breathing soft in the cold chamber, she sat alone, her eyes upon the barred window. Beyond it, the sky stretched dark, the stars hidden by clouds, the city restless beneath. She may have whispered prayers for her husband's soul, for her children's future, for her own courage. And in the silence, she may have heard again the drums, faint yet endless, echoing not only through Paris, but through her very heart. The smoke of sacrifice still hung in the air, and though the blade was silent for now, its shadow lengthened, reaching ever closer to the queen herself. The drums of execution still echoed in her chest, but now they were joined by another sound, one quieter, yet more devastating. The fading footsteps in the prison corridors as her children were led away. The queen, once surrounded by courtiers and companions, once burdened by the endless gaze of Versailles, now found herself in a solitude far harsher than any scrutiny. The walls of the temple prison were bare and cold, the windows narrow, the air thick with dampness and silence. No music drifted through these halls, no scent of perfume lingered, only stone and shadow remained, broken by the heavy steps of guards who watched her not as queen but as captive. The separation from her son was the cruelest blow. The boy, the Dauphin of France, once heir to a throne, was torn from her side and given into the hands of revolutionaries who sought not to care for him but to unmake him. They filled his ears with accusations against his mother, forced him to repeat words of condemnation he could not understand. His innocence, once her comfort, was twisted into a weapon against her. The queen, left behind, listened in anguish to the knowledge that her child's voice, once filled with laughter, now echoed with rehearsed hatred. What greater torment could a mother endure than to know her child was taught to curse her name? Her daughter remained with her longer, a fragile companion in captivity, but even that bond was fraught with sorrow. Together they prayed, whispered, held one another in the cold of the night. Yet the girl, too, was marked by loss, her eyes older than her years, her smile fading under the weight of grief. The queen drew strength from her daughter's presence, yet she knew that the revolution would not spare her either. To love in those days was to suffer, for every bond became another wound when it was torn away. The guards treated her with a harsh indifference, some with open cruelty, some with a silence more cutting than words. She who had once commanded entire courts now waited for permission to move, to speak, to breathe without suspicion. Her meals were meager, her clothing plain, her chamber stripped of comfort. Yet in her bearing she remained resolute. Even when humiliated, even when insulted, she carried herself as queen, her dignity, her last possession. They could strip her of jewels, of silks, of freedom, but they could not strip her of her composure. Alone in her cell, she turned to prayer. Her rosary beads slipped through her fingers, her lips moving silently, her eyes closed against the darkness. She prayed not for deliverance, but for endurance, not for revenge, but for strength. She prayed for her children, for her husband's soul, for a France that no longer wanted her. Prayer became her last refuge, a rhythm steadier than the footsteps of guards, a light softer but more enduring than candles. Yet nights in captivity were long. The silence stretched endlessly, broken only by distant cries from the city or the groan of iron doors. She lay upon a narrow bed, the stone walls pressing close, the chill seeping into her bones. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it brought dreams of gardens long gone, of Vienna's lilacs, of fountains in Versailles. But each morning she awoke to the same stone, the same iron, the same solitude. Memory was her only escape, and memory can be both balm and torment. Letters smuggled in and out brought brief flickers of connection, words of sympathy, words of encouragement, words that reminded her she was not entirely forgotten. Yet each letter also carried danger, for discovery meant punishment. She wrote cautiously, her handwriting steady, her tone calm, though within her heart trembled. To write was to breathe, to affirm that she still existed beyond the walls, that her voice had not been silenced entirely, and yet, despite all, she did not surrender to despair. Alone, she straightened her back, lifted her head, and faced her captors with eyes that betrayed neither fear nor submission. In solitude, she found a strange strength, the kind born not of hope for survival, but of acceptance of fate. She knew now that her path led only to the scaffold, yet she resolved to meet it with dignity, to deny her enemies the sight of her broken. If they would take her life, they would not take her courage. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, she listened for footsteps, half hoping, half dreading. The footsteps of guards meant intrusion, but the absence of footsteps meant unbearable isolation. Silence can be heavier than noise, more suffocating than shouts. And so she listened, always, for the faintest sound, for any reminder that she was not entirely forgotten by the living world. The city outside did not sleep. Paris thrummed with life, with debates, with executions, with a revolution that consumed itself even as it consumed its monarchs. But in her narrow cell the queen sat alone, her world reduced to stone and memory. The woman who had once been mocked for extravagance now lived with nothing but the clothes upon her back. The queen once accused of laughter now sat in silence. The woman once condemned for her supposed indifference now suffered the deepest wounds of loss and love. At dusk, light seeped faintly through the barred window, painting the walls with thin lines of gold. She sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady upon the fragment of sky she could still see. The air carried with it the faint scent of smoke from the city, mingling with the dampness of stone. She closed her eyes and breathed, as though in that breath she could hold both the memory of freedom and the reality of captivity. The footsteps faded once more, leaving her in silence, and in that silence she felt both the weight of despair and the flicker of defiance. For though she was alone, though she was captive, though her children were torn from her, she was still Marie Antoinette. And she would endure until the end, her spirit unbroken, her dignity intact, even as the walls pressed ever closer. The footsteps in the prison corridors had faded, leaving her in solitude, yet new sounds soon arose, louder, harsher, filled not with indifference but with accusation. They came not from guards but from the voices of judges, prosecutors, and crowds who gathered not to hear truth, but to witness condemnation. The queen was summoned at last to stand trial, and in that summons her fate was sealed, for the revolution had no intention of granting her justice. It sought only her destruction, and the trial became the stage upon which her ruin would be performed. She was led from her cell, her figure thinner now, her face pale from months of confinement, yet her bearing remained steady. She wore no jewels, no silks, nothing of the splendor that had once adorned her, and yet she seemed to carry with her the same dignity she had always borne. The court was crowded, the air heavy with the murmurs of onlookers, their eyes fixed upon her with curiosity, hatred, or cold satisfaction. To them, she was not a woman, but a symbol, the embodiment of monarchy, of privilege, of all they sought to erase. The charges read against her were wild, cruel, and often grotesque. She was accused of conspiring with foreign powers, of draining the treasury, of corrupting the morals of the court. Most monstrous of all, she was accused of crimes against her own son, of corruption so vile it shocked even her enemies. When the words were spoken, when the accusations fell upon her like stones, she rose to her feet, her eyes flashing not with fear but with indignation. She looked upon her accusers, upon the crowded court, and spoke with calm, steady voice. "I appeal to all mothers present." Her words silenced the hall. For a moment the weight of her humanity pierced through the haze of hatred. Even some among the women in the crowd who had come to curse her were struck to stillness. They may have despised the queen, but they understood the plea of a mother accused of unspeakable crimes against her child. For one instant truth shone through, and in that instant the myth faltered. Yet the trial did not halt. The machinery of condemnation ground on, relentless, unmoved by compassion. Witnesses testified, some bought, some coerced, some eager for their moment of attention. Evidence was twisted, words distorted, intentions reshaped into malice. The queen's dignity, her calm, her occasional flashes of sorrow could not alter the outcome. She had been condemned long before she entered the court. The trial was not judgment, but theater, and the verdict had already been written. Still, she faced her accusers with composure. She did not beg, did not collapse, did not rage. She answered with restraint, defended herself with reason, carried herself not as a woman broken, but as a queen determined to meet her end with courage. Those who despised her saw defiance. Those who pitied her saw dignity, but all saw a woman who would not surrender her spirit, even as her body was bound. The crowd outside roared for her death, their voices filling the air beyond the courtroom walls. They had cheered the king's execution, and now they demanded the queen's. Her name had become their rallying cry, their scapegoat, their proof that the old world was ending. And within the court, their cry echoed in the verdict. She was declared guilty on all charges, sentenced to death by guillotine. The queen listened in silence, her face calm, her body still. She made no plea, shed no tears, offered no protest. When the words of condemnation were spoken, she bowed her head briefly, then lifted it again, her gaze steady, her expression composed. In that moment she seemed not defeated but transcendent, as though she had already passed beyond fear. The court had sought to humiliate her, to strip her of dignity, but instead her dignity grew, for she faced death not with trembling, but with poise. That night she was returned to her cell, the verdict heavy upon her, yet strangely freeing. For months she had lived in uncertainty, waiting for fate to reveal itself. Now fate had spoken, and though it promised death, it also ended the torment of waiting. She prayed. She wrote a final letter to her sister-in-law, filled not with bitterness, but with calm, with forgiveness, with thoughts for her children. Her words carried the dignity of one who knew that death was near and chose to meet it with grace. The silence of her cell was deeper that night, as though the walls themselves knew this was their final vigil with her. She sat in the dim light, her hands folded, her eyes steady. Outside, Paris stirred, the city alive with anticipation, its people eager for the spectacle of a queen brought low. But within her heart there was no spectacle, only acceptance, only the steady beat of courage against the tide of hatred, the echoes of her defense. "I appeal to all mothers," still lingered, unresolved, carrying into the night like a whisper of truth that even the revolution could not entirely silence. The whisper of her final defense still lingered in the air. "I appeal to all mothers." But by dawn it had faded into silence, and silence gave way to the sound of footsteps in the prison corridor. It was the morning of October 16th, 1793, the last morning of Marie Antoinette's life. The city outside already stirred, restless, eager, its people gathering in expectation of the spectacle. Within her cell, the queen rose from her narrow bed, her body weary from months of confinement, yet her bearing calm, her eyes steady. She had faced judgment, and now she faced death, and she resolved to meet it with the dignity of one who had nothing left to lose but herself. Her white gown was prepared, plain and unadorned, a stark contrast to the silks and jewels she had once worn. She dressed slowly, deliberately, as though each movement were part of a ritual of farewell. No crown adorned her head, no necklace encircled her throat, only the simplicity of cloth, the dignity of composure. In that moment she seemed not the Queen of France, but a figure of quiet endurance, stripped of splendor, yet not of grace. Her hair, once powdered and styled with elaborate care, was shorn roughly, her face pale, but her posture remained erect. Even her enemies remarked upon her composure, as though she carried within her something unbroken by humiliation. The letter she had written the night before lay folded, her final words to her sister-in-law, filled not with rage, but with forgiveness. She had written of her sorrow for her children, of her prayers for strength, of her wish for peace. There was no bitterness in her hand, no malice in her tone. She forgave those who condemned her. She prayed for those who guarded her. She entrusted her soul to God. In that letter, her true voice endured, untainted by rumor, untouched by the cruelty of pamphlets or caricature. When the guards entered, she stood ready. They bound her hands behind her back, a gesture meant to humiliate, yet she did not falter. She stepped into the corridor, her gown whispering against the stone, her footsteps steady, her head held high. The prison doors opened, and the sound of Paris rushed in. Shouts, murmurs, the restless hum of a crowd hungry for spectacle. She was led to the waiting cart, a simple wooden vehicle, rough and unadorned, pulled by a horse that stamped its hooves impatiently. The queen, who had once ridden in gilded carriages, now mounted the cart with calm resolve, seating herself upright, her bound hands pressing against the wood. The cart creaked forward, wheels grinding over cobblestones, and the city unfolded around her. Crowds lined the streets, their faces twisted with anger, with curiosity, with triumph. Some shouted insults, some hurled curses, some merely stared. The cry of "Down with the Austrian" rang through the air, a reminder that even in death she was a foreigner in their eyes. Yet she did not lower her gaze. She looked forward, her face composed, her eyes calm. Those who saw her were struck by her bearing, by the dignity that clung to her, even in humiliation. She did not weep, did not beg, did not collapse. She rode as though she were not prisoner, but witness, as though she herself watched the unfolding of destiny. The ride was long, the cart moving slowly through crowded streets. Paris seemed both alive and cruel, its voices a relentless tide pressing against her. She saw faces jeering, hands gesturing, mouths shouting. Yet above it all she heard the roll of drums, steady, unyielding, drowning even the insults. The drums that had silenced her husband now silenced her, their rhythm marking the march toward death. She sat motionless, listening, her body swaying gently with the movement of the cart, her mind perhaps already beyond the crowd, beyond the noise, beyond the city itself. At last the scaffold came into view, stark against the gray sky. Its wooden beams rose dark and unadorned, the blade gleaming faintly at its summit. Around it gathered the multitude, their voices rising in anticipation, their eyes fixed upon her. She descended from the cart with steady steps, her white gown bright against the rough wood, her bound hands forcing her to maintain balance with care. She stumbled once upon the steps, and in that moment she turned to her executioner and spoke quietly. "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." Even at the threshold of death, she asked forgiveness for a misstep, her words calm, her tone composed. She mounted the scaffold, the drums rolling, the crowd shouting, the blade above gleaming. She stood tall, her face serene, her eyes lifted. No speech was granted her, no words permitted to carry beyond the din. She knelt, her head placed upon the block, her hair falling forward, her white gown pooling around her. For a moment silence seemed to linger, the city holding its breath. And then the blade fell, swift and final, its sound sharp against the air. The crowd erupted, a roar of triumph, of release, of fury spent. The head of the queen was lifted, blood staining the wood, and the people shouted as they had shouted for her husband. Yet among the roar, there were those who stood silent, struck not by triumph, but by the dignity with which she had met her end. Even enemies, even strangers could not deny the courage she had shown, the composure that had never faltered. Her body was carried away, her head displayed, her name cursed and cheered, her life ended. Yet in that last morning, in the plain white gown, in the quiet words of forgiveness, in the calm steps to the scaffold, she had reclaimed something no pamphlet, no rumor, no caricature could erase. She had been mocked, slandered, condemned, but she had met death with dignity, and dignity is beyond the reach of lies. The city moved on, the roar of the crowd fading into the hum of daily life, the drums ceasing, the scaffold standing silent against the sky. But the image of the queen in her white gown, walking steadily to her end, lingered, unresolved, like a candle flame trembling in the wind, yet refusing to die. The scaffold stood silent when the roar of the crowd began to fade, its timbers dark with blood, its blade catching the last faint light of an autumn sky. The queen's body was carried away, her head lifted high for the people to see, and Paris roared in triumph as though hunger itself had been silenced, as though justice had been done. Yet the roar, so fierce in the moment, dissolved quickly into the restless hum of the city. The bread remained scarce, the streets remained crowded, the voices remained hungry. The queen was gone, but the suffering endured, and in that endurance her death became not resolution, but symbol. Pamphlets scattered in the wind carried her image, her name, her supposed words, repeating the myths that had condemned her. Even in death, she was not granted peace. She was transformed into legend, into warning, into story. The revolutionaries declared her downfall proof that monarchy itself was shattered, that crowns could no longer claim divinity, that queens could not forever dance while the people starved. Yet the stories told of her were not simple triumphs of justice. They were tangled in cruelty, in exaggeration, in invention. Caricatures multiplied, showing her not as she had been in her last calm morning, but as the figure they had long imagined, extravagant, mocking, careless, laughing over famine. The truth of her final dignity was drowned beneath the ink of rumor, for the people did not wish to remember her composure. They wished to remember their victory, and victory required a villain. Her name was spoken across Europe, in courts where kings and queens trembled, in salons where philosophers debated, in taverns where commoners drank. To some she was martyr, innocent of the crimes for which she died, a queen who faced her end with courage that ennobled her suffering. To others she was warning, a symbol of monarchy's arrogance, a lesson in the cost of blindness, to the cries of the people. In every telling she was changed, reshaped, reimagined. Marie Antoinette, the woman, was gone. Marie Antoinette, the symbol, remained, and symbols outlive flesh. Within Paris, the wind carried pamphlets through narrow alleys, their papers crumpling, their ink smudging, yet their message clear. Songs were sung mocking her. Children repeated the phrase she never spoke, "Let them eat cake," as though it were history itself. Her life, so complex, so human in its longing and error, was reduced to a handful of words, to an image that could be carried in the pocket, whispered in the marketplace, shouted in the crowd. The truth of her tears, her solitude, her motherhood, her prayers, these were forgotten. The legend of the frivolous queen, careless and cruel, endured. And yet, even among her enemies, there were those who could not entirely forget the sight of her on the scaffold, dressed in white, walking with steady steps, asking pardon when she stumbled, bowing her head with dignity. The memory lingered, faint but unshakable, like the echo of a bell long after its ringing has ceased. Some whispered that in her final hour she had shown courage greater than many men, that in her silence she had spoken more than in any defense. For death strips away illusion, and in her death there was truth, though few chose to see it. Across Europe, refugees carried tales of her downfall. Monarchs trembled, imagining themselves upon the same scaffold, their crowns slipping like hers. Writers crafted stories, some pitying, some cruel, each weaving her life into the fabric of history. And in Vienna, where she had once run laughing through gardens scented with lilacs, her family mourned not only her death, but the shadow cast upon her name. The child of Vienna had become the doomed queen of France, her laughter twisted into mockery, her innocence forgotten. Time did not soften her image. The revolution moved forward, consuming itself, devouring those who had once condemned her. The guillotine fell again and again, its blade indifferent to guilt or innocence, its wood darkened with blood not only of kings and queens, but of those who had once shouted loudest for their deaths. And in that cycle of vengeance, the memory of Marie Antoinette became at once distant and near, distant in her foreignness, near in the reminder that no one was safe. The pamphlets scattered in the wind eventually dissolved into dust, their ink fading, their paper torn. Yet the myths they carried survived, handed down not on paper but in memory, in retelling, in the easy cruelty of stories simplified for convenience. Children grew into adults believing she had said what she had not said, believing she had feasted while they starved, believing she had lived in careless laughter. And so the myth endured longer than the truth, because myths are easier to believe than complexity, and easier to carry than compassion. The queen had fallen, but in her fall she had become something larger than herself. She was no longer Antonia, no longer Marie Antoinette, no longer mother or widow or prisoner. She was symbol, she was warning, she was legend. Her life had ended upon the scaffold, yet her image lived on, scattered in pamphlets, sung in songs, whispered in stories, painted in caricatures, debated in books. She had been devoured by history, yet in being devoured, she was made eternal. The wind that scattered the pamphlets also scattered memory, carrying fragments of her across fields and cities, across generations and centuries. And still, when the wind rose, it seemed to carry with it the faint rustle of paper, the faint echo of voices shouting her name, cursing or mourning, mocking or admiring. For the fall of a queen is never final. It lingers, unresolved, like a story told and retold, reshaped by each voice that speaks it. And so her image drifted, unresolved, like the scraps of paper caught in the wind, fluttering, circling, refusing to settle. The scraps of paper that fluttered in the wind, carrying her image and her legend, settled at last into silence. Yet silence is never empty. It holds within it echoes, unresolved questions, fragments of memory that linger long after the events themselves are gone. So it is with Marie Antoinette. Her body was laid to rest in an unmarked grave, her name condemned in the tumult of her age, yet her memory refused to vanish. It survived not as a single truth, but as a weave of contradictions, martyr and monster, innocent and guilty, frivolous and courageous. History, ever restless, could not decide, and so her image drifted like smoke, shifting with each telling. In the centuries that followed, her story was retold countless times. In some, she was the careless queen who mocked her people. In others, she was the tragic victim of forces beyond her control. Painters cast her in pastel gowns, radiant yet distant. Writers sharpened her into caricature or softened her into heroine. Historians traced her steps through Versailles, through the Tuileries, through the Temple, measuring each moment against the myths that had already claimed her. Yet for all the words written, for all the portraits painted, the truth remained elusive, like water slipping through the fingers. What do we know of her, truly? We know she was born into music and marble in Vienna, a child laughing amid lilacs. We know she was stripped of her garments at the border, remade into a symbol before she could understand the weight of such transformation. We know she was mocked as a bride, condemned as barren, then condemned again as careless when she bore children at last. We know she sought refuge in the Petit Trianon, where sheep bells rang softly but became twisted into proof of insult. We know she was entangled in scandals she did not weave, accused of words she did not speak, bound to rumors she could never silence. We know she met death with courage, stepping onto the scaffold in a white gown, her last words simple, her bearing unbroken. These things we know, and yet beyond them lies a woman who remains hidden, her heart veiled by history's distortions. Perhaps the truth of Marie Antoinette lies not in judgment but in ambiguity. She was frivolous, yes, but also burdened. She loved beauty and play, yet she endured solitude and grief. She was careless at times, yet she showed courage at the end. She was no saint, no demon, but human, and humanity resists simplification. Yet the world prefers symbols to complexity, myths to truth. And so she became a canvas upon which anger and pity alike were painted, her image shifting with the needs of each generation. Even now, her name stirs debate. Was she heartless or misunderstood? Was she architect of her downfall or victim of inevitability? Did she embody the decadence of a monarchy doomed by its own blindness, or did she stand as scapegoat for a people's rage? The questions remain, unanswered, unanswerable. For history is not mathematics. It is memory, fragile and shifting, shaped as much by imagination as by fact. There is, too, the haunting image of her final hours. The queen who once walked amid gilded mirrors now sat in a bare cell, writing words of forgiveness, whispering prayers in the silence. The woman once mocked for extravagance now dressed in plain white, stepping calmly to the scaffold. The mother who had once held her children close now walked alone, her hands bound, her face serene. That image, more than rumor, more than caricature, lingers, refusing to be erased. In it lies her humanity, her dignity, her mystery. Time has softened the harshness of her reputation. The revolution itself consumed those who condemned her, the guillotine sparing none, its blade indifferent to ideology. In the centuries that followed, kings returned, kings fell, republics rose, empires crumbled, yet the figure of Marie Antoinette remained, hovering between pity and scorn. In gardens, in books, in films, in paintings, her image reappears, never the same, always refracted through the needs of those who remember. She became, paradoxically, immortal in her ruin. And perhaps that is her final legacy. Not what she was, but what she became in memory. For to be remembered, even distorted, is to remain alive in the minds of generations. The people who cursed her name are gone. The pamphlets that mocked her have turned to dust. The revolution itself is now history. Yet her name is still spoken, her face still painted, her story still told. The queen who fell has not vanished. She has become timeless, suspended between myth and truth. If we close our eyes and listen, what do we hear? Perhaps the faint laughter of a girl in Vienna, running through gardens where lilacs bloom. Perhaps the rustle of silk in Versailles, the murmur of fountains echoing through gilded halls. Perhaps the distant toll of drums in Paris, rolling like thunder through the streets. Perhaps the silence of a cell, broken only by whispered prayers. And perhaps, too, the sound of a blade falling, sharp and final, followed by the roar of a crowd. All these sounds blend into one story, one life, one memory, and in the end, what remains? Not certainty, not final judgment, but mystery. For Marie Antoinette, the doomed Queen of France, was both more and less than history has made of her. She was human, fragile, flawed, courageous, condemned. She was laughter and sorrow, myth and reality, light and shadow. And as the candle burns low, casting its glow upon cold marble, her image flickers still, neither saint nor monster, but a woman caught forever between memory and mystery. The flame trembles, then fades into darkness, unresolved.